Close your eyes and picture a market square at dawn, its cobblestones damp with dew, the air scented with bread just pulled from ovens, smoke drifting gently from hearths as stalls are raised one by one. You hear the shuffle of boots, the rustle of fabric, the creak of wooden carts, all soft and unhurried, as if time itself moves slower here. At first glance it feels ordinary, just a place where villagers trade eggs for cheese or cloth for salt. But here's the quiet twist. These markets were not only places of buying and selling, they were theatres of life. Places where gossip spread faster than coin, where justice was read aloud beside the butcher's stall, where strangers might bring news from kingdoms far away. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how the market was less about goods and more about connection. The heartbeat of medieval towns, pulsing gently beneath banners and bells. As you breathe slowly, imagine the glow of lanterns as stalls open, the hush before the day's voices rise. Together, we'll wander deeper into this world, chapter by chapter, until the square feels as real and familiar as your own street. Only quieter, cozier, lit by candlelight and the murmur of distant bells. And now, as we step together into the first morning of our medieval market, imagine the sky just beginning to pale with the faintest light of dawn. A soft grey stretched like wool across the horizon, and beneath it the cobbled square lies quiet for only a moment more. For already the earliest traders are stirring, their carts creaking along narrow lanes, wheels crunching over stones still wet with dew, the muffled thud of hooves as donkeys pull wagons laden with sacks of grain, barrels of ale and baskets of vegetables pulled from dark soil the evening before. And as you breathe softly with me, you can almost hear the rustle of cloth as stall awnings are unfolded, the gentle tap of wooden pegs driven into place, the faint chiming of bells from the church tower striking the hour that calls the town awake. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this daily act of unfolding a market was not simply routine, but ceremonial, a rhythm repeated across generations, as familiar as breathing, yet each morning carrying its own little surprises. A stranger arriving with goods never before seen, a baker offering loaves with crusts darkened perfectly by the oven's heat, a merchant spreading bright ribbons across a stall, catching the weak light and shimmering like jewels in the mist. And in this way the square began to come alive, gently, quietly, as if not to disturb the peace of night, to suddenly breathe again and notice how the air itself seemed layered, the smoke of hearths winding upward from chimneys to join the fog, the scent of hay and horses mingling with the sharper tang of onions and cabbages, and the sweetness of honey cakes carried on trays, and all these scents blending into an atmosphere so distinct that travellers, weary from days on the road, would know at once that they had reached a place of gathering, a place of trade, and also of stories, for markets were always both. Let us turn the lamp a little lower and linger with a single figure, perhaps a farmer's wife in a woolen cloak patched at the elbow, her hands rough but steady as she arranges eggs in straw-lined baskets, the shells pale brown, speckled, each one precious, each one a link between her hens at home and the bustling crowd that would soon surround her. And in her quiet care lies something remarkable, for though history often remembers kings and knights, it is these humble acts that sustained life, the patient carrying, arranging, exchanging, all done without fanfare, yet essential to the very fabric of the town. Stay with me, for just beyond her stall a butcher lifts a cleaver, not with menace, but with practiced grace, carving portions of salted pork, each slice weighed against small copper coins, while next to him a weaver unfolds bolts of coarse cloth dyed in muted shades, greens and browns mostly, though one or two threads of brighter hue gleam like sunlight trapped in wool, and buyers run their hands over the fabric, murmuring in soft voices, bargaining with nods and gestures as much as with words, the way of trade older than memory. And here is the gentle twist promised in our hook. The market was never merely a place of buying and selling. It was a stage upon which daily life was performed, where news was exchanged more quickly than coin, where travellers brought tales from distant regions, where proclamations from the crown were read aloud, posted on wooden boards, or declared by a crier standing near the church steps, his voice carrying above the chatter. And so every market day was also a lesson in belonging, a reminder that no matter how small the village, it was part of a larger web of kingdom, faith, and community. Breathe softly, and picture children darting between stalls, their laughter like bright notes of music as they chase one another past baskets of apples, or pause wide-eyed at a confectioner's tray filled with candied nuts glistening like amber, their sweetness rare and treasured, while nearby older men gather at a tavern's open door, sipping ale from wooden mugs, muttering about the weather and the harvest, voices low but steady, their words weaving the fabric of shared knowledge that kept villagers strong. In a moment, you'll see why the smallest of details mattered. The ring of a hammer as a blacksmith demonstrated nails and horseshoes, sparks flying softly in daylight. The careful display of herbs by an apothecary, their leaves bundled neatly with twine, lavender and rosemary filling the air with calming scents. The gleam of pewter spoons on a merchant's table catching light like water. Each sound and image a thread in the larger tapestry of the market, a place both ordinary and extraordinary. Breathe once more, and imagine the square now fully alive by mid. The crowd pressing gently against stalls, coins passing from hand to hand, cloth measured, bread broken, fish weighed and salted, voices overlapping in a hum as steady as bees in summer. And within it all, the sense of safety, of belonging, of rhythm. The market as the beating heart of the town, pulsing each week with energy that carried people forward through lean times and bountiful seasons alike. Stay with me, because in a few paragraphs we'll step aside to watch the town crier again, this time reading out not only royal decrees but local disputes settled by the bailiff. Decisions about land or inheritance declared aloud so that the community itself bore witness. And in this way, the market was also a place of justice, of order, of memory, as much as it was of trade. And yet, despite all its bustle, there was never hurry, never panic, but a steady rhythm, like the tide washing upon a shore, predictable, soothing, allowing everyone to find their place, whether noble or peasant, traveller or townsman, each drawn into the gentle web of exchange. So as the sun climbs higher and shadows shorten, let us pause together, letting the hum of voices, the scent of fresh bread, the glimmer of cloth and coin wrap around us like a blanket. For in this simple yet profound space lies the essence of medieval life, connection, community, and the steady breath of shared existence. And as this first chapter closes, imagine yourself standing at the edge of the square, a basket in hand, the warmth of the sun on your shoulders, the murmur of voices around you, safe and unhurried, ready to step deeper into the life of the market, which, as we will see in the next chapter, was not only a place of trade and proclamation, but a window into the wider world, where goods, ideas, and friendships crossed paths in ways that quietly shaped the course of history. And now, as the sun climbs a little higher and the square swells with voices and footsteps, let us wander deeper into the medieval market, where not everyone we meet has walked from a nearby village or brought eggs from their own hens. For some have traveled for days, even weeks, carrying goods from distant regions, and with them they bring not only wares but whispers of far off lands, so that the market becomes a crossroads where the local and the foreign meet in gentle harmony. And you, standing here in the midst of it, can feel the current of the wider world flowing quietly through this small square. Breathe softly with me, and imagine a merchant arriving with a packed mule laden with rolls of fine Flemish cloth, each bolt smoother than the coarse wool of local looms, dyed in deep blues and reds that shimmer against the morning light. And as he unrolls them across his stall, villagers gasp softly, hands reaching out to brush the fabric, eyes wide with wonder at colors they could not reproduce at home. And though the cost in coin might be too great for most, the sight itself is a gift, a glimpse of possibilities beyond their horizon, stirring dreams even as their purses remain light. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how these travelers carried more than fabric. Here comes a man from the south, with spices sealed in small leather pouches, cinnamon and cloves, pepper and saffron, their scents sharp and sweet against the heavier odors of salted meat and damp wool, and the apothecary, already leaning over his table of herbs, nods approvingly. For these spices not only flavor food, but serve as remedies, each grain or thread a treasure, measured carefully by weight, sold sparingly to those who can afford their rarity, and yet their fragrance drifts on the air, so that even those who cannot breathe in the mystery of distant seas, breathe again and turn your head toward the sound of foreign accents. For there are merchants from Italy too, their wagons carrying glass beads and trinkets that sparkle like drops of water, and perhaps a few silk ribbons wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect them from rain. And though such luxuries seem fragile and almost otherworldly compared to the sturdy wooden bowls or wool cloaks of local stalls, their presence transforms the square into something larger than itself, a space that connects faraway ports, mountain passes, and winding rivers with the daily lives of bakers and farmers, reminding all who gather here that the world is wide and full of wonders. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how these goods brought with them stories. The spice seller speaking of a port where ships with red sails unload cargo from lands hotter than any English summer. The cloth merchant describing looms in cities that never sleep. The Italian glass trader telling of canals and towers reflected in water. And though his words may be softened or exaggerated by the desire to sell, they are still windows into places most listeners will never see. And the crowd gathers not only for the goods, but for the tales, their imaginations carried outward even as their feet remain planted on cobblestones. And here lies the gentle revelation that the market, while rooted firmly in the local square, was always a portal to the wider world. The hum of voices a kind of map where roads converged, rivers flowed, seas linked, and people who would never leave their village could still taste a fig, feel silk between their fingers, or hear a story of cities across the mountains. Breathe softly, and imagine how children pressed close, eyes round as coins, ears straining to catch every word of these travelers, their minds filled with visions of exotic animals or palaces of marble. And how later, when the stalls had closed and the families gathered at hearths, those children repeated what they had heard, their voices weaving stories that glowed brighter than the flames, so that markets did not only feed the body but also the imagination, binding villages into the larger fabric of Europe. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice another kind of traveler in the crowd. Pilgrims with badges pinned to their cloaks, proof of journeys to holy shrines. And they too brought tales, not of trade but of devotion, describing chapels by the sea, relics displayed in glass, the kindness of strangers along the road, and villagers listened with reverence, reminded that the market was not only a place of coin and goods, but also a space where faith, experience, and community intertwined, where the sacred and the mundane walked side by side. Breathe again, and let yourself picture the apothecary now haggling with a spice merchant, both leaning close, their fingers tapping on scales as they weigh out peppercorns glistening like beads, while across the square the farmer's wife who sold eggs earlier now holds a tiny pouch of saffron threads, her eyes shining as she imagines the golden color it will bring to her bread, a small indulgence, a festival treat. And such exchanges remind us that the market was both practical and magical, both grounded in need and lifted by wonder. And here, my friend, as the sun begins its climb toward noon, the market hum grows louder, more layered, the rhythm of bargaining and laughter and proclamation blending into a living song, a sound that was both ancient and new each week. And within that sound lies the heartbeat of connection, the pulse of a community stretched outward across mountains and seas, yet still rooted firmly here, in this square where you and I now stand together. Breathe softly, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself holding a small coin in your palm, warm from your hand, ready to trade it for a ribbon or a fig, or perhaps only for a story told by a merchant whose eyes gleam with memories of lands beyond the horizon. And let that moment remind you that the medieval market was never just a place of goods, but a place of possibility, where the world opened gently before you, inviting you to listen, to dream, to belong. And now, as the market square settles into the full rhythm of the day, let us linger not on any single stall or merchant, but on the tapestry of sensations that weave the entire space together. For a medieval market was not only seen with the eyes, but lived with all the senses, every breath, every sound, every touch carrying its own detail, its own story. And if you stay with me a little longer, you will begin to notice how each of these layers created an atmosphere both lively and soothing, a hum of life that made the square feel like the heart of the town itself. Breathe softly with me and listen first to the sounds, the overlapping voices of sellers calling out prices, buyers answering with questions, children laughing as they dart between stalls, the low bray of a donkey tugging at its harness, the cluck of hens in wicker cages, the rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer striking iron at the edge of the square, steady and echoing, and the occasional toll of the church bell above, cutting through the noise not as a disruption but as a kind of anchor, reminding all who traded and bargained that time itself moved quietly above their busyness. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll also hear the smaller sounds, the whisper of fabric being unrolled, the crisp crackle of straw underfoot, the splash of water poured into troughs for thirsty animals, the faint chime of coins dropping into wooden bowls, each sound carrying intimacy, as though the square itself were breathing, sighing and humming all at once. And if you let your attention drift, you will find it soothing, a lullaby disguised as commerce. Breathe again, and let us move toward the scents that fill the air. For if the sounds weave music, Then the aromas paint the invisible walls of the square, rich and layered. From the sweet fragrance of honey cakes laid in neat rows on a baker's tray, to the sharp bite of onions and garlic strung together in braids, to the heavy salted temps of fish unpacked from barrels filled with brine, and mingled with these, the earthy scent of damp wool, the metallic trace of worked iron, the warm, comforting aroma of fresh bread torn open, still steaming, and above it all, the smoky thread of hearth fires, their wood smoke curling into the morning air like ribbons of grey silk. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how these scents did not stand alone, but combined into a symphony of place. A fragrance so distinct that anyone returning to the square after long absence would know instantly where they stood, as if the market itself had its own perfume, its own memory. Breathe softly, and let us turn to the sights. Already bright with midday sun, spilling light across stalls where fabrics glowed in shades of deep green, indigo blue and warm brown, their folds catching every shift of the breeze, while apples and pears, polished by the merchant's cloth, shone like jewels upon wooden boards, and baskets of eggs, carefully arranged, reflected the soft sheen of morning light. And across the way the silvery gleam of pewter bowls seemed almost to float against the darker wood of their table. Yet alongside these bright sights were the humbler ones, boots muddied by travel, hands rough with work, cloaks patched and worn, faces lined with years of labour, and in these small human details lay the real richness of the market. For here was not only beauty but truth, the mingling of wealth and want, hope and hardship, all gathered into one square, sharing one space. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how touch mattered, how the market was a place where hands were always busy, feeling, weighing, comparing, a woman running her palm over cloth to test its weave, a man lifting an apple and pressing its skin to judge its firmness, a child reaching out shyly to touch the smooth curve of a glass bead, then drawing back quickly as though the trinket were too magical to hold, and coins themselves, warmed by skin, pressed into open palms, exchanged with murmured thanks, each touch binding buyer and seller in quiet trust. Breathe once more, and imagine taste, though not every mouthful was bought. For sometimes merchants offered samples, a slice of cheese sharp on the tongue, a sip of ale, cool and bitter, a sugared almond crunching sweetly. And these tastes, fleeting yet vivid, stitched the memory of the market deep into those who walked its paths. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that a medieval market was less a place of transaction than an experience of immersion, a gathering of senses into harmony, where even if no purchase was made, one left fuller, richer, fed by sound and scent, by sight and touch, by story and community, and in that fullness lay its true value, greater than any coin could measure. Breathe softly with me now, and see the square from above in your mind, a patchwork of awnings and stalls, each corner with its own rhythm, yet blending into one steady hum, a living heartbeat of the town, carrying all who entered it into its embrace, so that by evening, when the stalls were folded and the cobbles swept, the memory of its fullness lingered like the scent of smoke after fire, comforting, constant, familiar. And so, as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing at the center of it all. The noise like music, the air heavy with bread and spice, the colors alive before your eyes, the ground firm beneath your feet, and feel the market as not just a place of goods, but as the soul of the town, a place where every sense was alive, every person connected, every moment steeped in the gentle hum of belonging. And in the next chapter, we will step aside to notice not only the trades themselves, but the rituals, the customs, and the small laws that gave the market order, shaping it as much as stalls and wares ever did. And now, as we step further into the life of the medieval market, let us pause not on the goods or the bustle, but on the quiet framework that held all of this together. The customs, the rituals, the rules that guided every exchange. For without them, the square might have fallen into chaos. Yet with them, it became not only a place of trade, but a place of trust. A rhythm as steady as the tolling of the church bell above. And if you stay with me a little longer, you will begin to see how these rules were. Not heavy burdens, but gentle threads weaving the community together. A tapestry of order that allowed the market to breathe peacefully week after week. Breathe softly with me, and notice first the presence of the bailiff or steward, a figure appointed by the lord of the manor or by the town council, walking slowly through the square with staff in hand, his cloak brushing the cobbles, his eyes watchful yet calm, for his duty was not to frighten but to ensure fairness, to see that weights were true, that measures were honest, that sellers did not cheat buyers with hollow loaves or watered ale. And though disputes sometimes arose in argument over the price of fish, a complaint about spoiled meat, they were handled in the open. Voices lowered, the bailiff stepping in with steady words, and often the simple act of his presence was enough to restore balance. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see another ritual. The inspection of weights and measures, when small brass or iron standards kept by the town were compared against those used by merchants. And if a weight was found to be false, it was not hidden but corrected in sight of all, so that every villager knew the scale was fair. And such public moments were less about punishment and more about reassurance, reminding the crowd that trust was guarded, that each coin exchanged truly carried its worth. Breathe again and imagine the town crier, who not only announced royal decrees, but also opened the market day itself, standing on the church steps with scroll in hand, calling aloud that trade was permitted, his voice carrying above the murmur, and when he finished, a hush settled briefly before the hum began again, as though the market itself had drawn a deep breath and exhaled into life. A ritual repeated so often it became part of the very bones of the town, a comfort as certain as sunrise. Stay with me, because in a moment you will notice how even the placement of stalls followed custom. The butchers clustered together near running water so that their scraps could be washed away. The fishmongers set apart for their strong scents. The cloth sellers near the square's edge where bolts could be unrolled easily. The bakers close to the tavern so their bread could be eaten with ale, and this arrangement, though simple, gave shape to the market, guiding feet, shaping flows of people, and creating small neighborhoods within the square, each with its own hum, its own identity. Breathe softly, and let us turn to the rituals of bargaining. For though coins passed hand to hand, words and gestures were just as important. The buyer asking softly for a lower price, the seller shaking his head, the buyer turning as if to leave, the seller calling back with a compromise. And though this dance might seem like conflict, it was in truth a kind of performance, a ritual understood by all, where both sides found satisfaction not only in the purchase, but in the conversation that preceded it. And in this way buying became less a transaction and more a story, shared and remembered. Stay with me, for in a moment you will also see how the church shaped the market. For it was not only bells that rang above, but rules that guided conduct. fairs forbidden on holy days, stalls cleared before Mass, certain goods blessed before sale. And in this way the sacred and the ordinary were bound together. Trade never separated from devotion, coin never far from prayer. Breathe again and picture the small customs of courtesy. How buyers thanked sellers with a nod, how disputes were often ended with a handshake, how a loaf of bread might be broken and shared as a sign of goodwill. And though life was hard and survival never guaranteed, these small courtesies softened the edges, turning necessity into community, trade into fellowship. Stay with me, because in a moment you will notice the seasonal rituals. How markets swelled during harvest time when grains were measured and stored. How winter markets smelled of smoked meats and candles. How spring brought herbs and flowers. How summer carried the sweet abundance of fruit. And each season gave its own rhythm, its own customs, its own expectations. So that villagers marked the passage of the year not only by feasts or fasts, but by the shifting face of the market itself. Breathe softly, and imagine now the great fairs, larger than the weekly market, lasting days, even weeks, when merchants came from across kingdoms, when minstrels played and acrobats performed, when cloth of silk and spices, rare beyond imagining, were displayed. And though such fairs were grand, they too were bound by rules. Gates closed at night. Guards patrolled the edges, disputes settled swiftly, contracts written and sealed, for even in the excitement of abundance, order was the thread that allowed joy to flourish without fear. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the market was not simply a place of noise and movement, but of balance, a harmony born not from chance, but from shared customs, from the acceptance of small rituals that everyone understood, the bell that began the day, the scales weighed against standards, the crier's voice, the placement of stalls, the bargaining words, the gestures of courtesy, the seasonal cycles. And all these, though ordinary, created an extraordinary sense of peace, a knowledge that the market was a safe place, a fair place, a place where the world's unpredictability was softened by the predictability of its rules. Breathe once more, and as you let these images settle in your mind, imagine yourself standing near the crier, hearing his voice declare the market open, watching as the bailiff inspects a scale, noticing how the butcher sharpens his knife while smiling at a familiar face, how the baker nods in greeting, how the weaver arranges cloth in patterns that have always followed the same rhythm, and let these rituals surround you like the steady ticking of a clock, soothing in their certainty, calming in their familiarity. And so, as this chapter draws gently to a close, you can rest knowing that the medieval market was not chaos but calm, not danger but order, shaped by customs that allowed every villager to step into its space with trust, to trade, to talk, to belong. And in the next chapter, we will move still closer, beyond rules and rituals, into the lives of the sellers themselves, to see how their work and their hopes were woven into each stall, each loaf, each bolt of cloth, carrying the human heart that made the market live. And now, as we walk once more into the crowded square, let us turn our attention away from the hum of the whole market and instead draw closer to the individuals who gave it voice, the sellers who set out their wares not merely as goods but as pieces of their own labor, their own hope, their own small fragments of story. For without them the market would be only an empty square, a hollow frame without color or sound. And if you stay with me a little longer, you will see how each seller brought not only bread or cloth or tools, but also themselves, their laughter, their care, their worries, their pride, shaping the market as much as its cobblestones and stalls. Breathe softly with me, and let us begin with the baker, who had risen hours before the first light of dawn, stoking his oven while the town still slept, his hands dusted white with flour, his face warmed by the fire. And by the time we pass his stall, the loaves are already stacked, their crusts golden, their smell filling the air with comfort. And his voice is kind but firm as he calls out to customers, offering round loaves for families, smaller rolls for travellers, honeyed buns for children who tug at their mother's sleeves. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how his work is not simply a trade but a bond. For each loaf he sells becomes a part of someone's table, a piece of their evening meal, a part of their memory of home. And though coins pass between hands, what lingers longer is the sense of being nourished, sustained, cared for, even by someone who may not know your name. Breathe again and walk a little further to the butcher's stall, where the man, broad-shouldered and confident, wears an apron stained from long hours of work, his cleaver resting nearby, though his smile is softer than his tools might suggest, for his trade, too, is rooted in providing, in ensuring families leave with meat salted for winter or fresh for stew. And though his voice carries loudly as he bargains, it is not harsh but hearty, a rhythm that reassures, a reminder that strength and sustenance are found together. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll meet the cloth seller, often a woman standing proudly behind bolts of wool and linen, her hands smoothing fabric as though each piece were alive, her eyes sharp for detail, noticing when a thread runs uneven, adjusting folds to show their best sheen. And here her pride shines, not in coins alone, but in the craft itself, in the knowledge that the wool came from sheep raised nearby, spun and dyed with care, that when a buyer chooses a length, they will wrap themselves, or their children, in warmth she helped bring into being. And in that moment, trade becomes something more intimate, almost familial. Breathe softly, and drift toward the apothecary. His table, a patchwork of herbs tied in small bundles, jars of dried leaves, vials of powders, each arranged neatly like a scholar's desk, and his manner is calm, his voice low as he explains to a mother how chamomile eases sleep, how rosemary clears the head, how lavender soothes the heart. And though he sells remedies, he also offers reassurance. His presence a quiet reminder that in a world where illness lurked close, knowledge and care could bring comfort. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see the potter, kneeling beside his wares, bowls and cups and jugs arranged in rows, their glazed surfaces catching sunlight like drops of water. And he runs a finger over one rim to show its smoothness, tapping another lightly to let the sound ring out, proving its strength. And as children watch, their eyes widen at the simple magic of clay transformed into something both useful and beautiful. And the potter smiles, for he knows his hands shape more than vessels, they shape the rhythm of daily life. The cups from which families drink, the bowls from which children eat. Objects so ordinary yet so essential that they carry within them a quiet dignity. Breathe again and pause near the spice merchant, his stall a contrast to the earthy goods nearby, for here small packets of colour and scent seem to glow like treasures. And his manner is half trader, half storyteller, describing lands where cinnamon trees grow tall, where saffron fields blaze gold, where pepper is worth its weight in silver. And though few by much, all lean in to listen, for he offers not only taste but imagination, carrying listeners far from their square into distant ports, into dreams of elsewhere. Stay with me, for in a moment you will meet the tanner. His trade less glamorous, his stall holding hides and leather straps. The smell strong, almost harsh, and yet his work is vital. His hands rough but skilled as he shapes belts. Shoes, harnesses, all things needed for travel, for work, for survival. And though his smile is faint, his pride rests in usefulness, in the knowledge that his craft supports journeys, labor, endurance. Breathe softly, unnoticed to the humble sellers. Women with baskets of eggs cushioned in straw. Men with bundles of firewood stacked neatly. Children sent with small trays of berries or nuts gathered from hedgerows. And though their goods are modest, their presence matters, for every basket, every bundle contributes to the fullness of the square, each one a thread in the fabric of abundance. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how personalities shaped the market's mood. The cheerful baker lifting spirits with his laughter, the stern butcher demanding fairness, the warm cloth seller drawing buyers close with her stories, the apothecary soothing worries, the potter delighting children, the spice merchant weaving wonder, the tanner grounding all in practicality. And together they formed not only a marketplace, but a chorus, each voice distinct yet blending into harmony. A community of sellers who carried the square on their shoulders. Breathe again, and imagine their day's end. The baker's table empty, the butcher cleaning his knives, the cloth seller folding the last remnants, the apothecary tying bundles for storage, the potter carefully stacking unsold cups, the spice merchant sealing pouches, the tanner loading hides, each one weary yet satisfied, knowing that their work had not only earned them coin, but had woven them into the lives of their neighbors, into meals, into warmth, into healing, into stories, into survival itself. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the market was not built of stalls and goods, but of people, of sellers whose personalities colored the square as much as any dye or spice, who gave it rhythm, trust, and life, and without whom the market would be silent stones, empty air. So, as this chapter closes, breathe softly with me and imagine yourself standing at the edge of the square, looking back one last time as the sellers pack their goods, their voices quiet now, their faces tired but content, and feel how much of themselves they left behind in the space, how their presence lingers like the fading scent of bread or the soft glow of pottery in the sun, and carry that warmth with you, for in the next chapter we will turn to the buyers, to those who filled the square not with goods but with stories of need and desire, showing us how the market shaped their lives in return. And now, as the stalls are filled and the sellers call out in steady voices, let us shift our gaze to the crowd that gives the market its true purpose. The buyers who arrive from cottages and villages near and far, each carrying not only coins in their purses or goods to barter, but also hopes, worries, desires, and needs. For without buyers, the market would be a silent stage. Yet with them it becomes a living play, every step and every word shaping the day's unfolding rhythm. And if you stay with me, you will see that their presence was as colorful and layered as the stalls themselves, each buyer bringing something unique, yet all bound together in the shared act of seeking, choosing, and carrying home. Breathe softly with me and notice first the farmer's wife, her basket on her arm, her cloak worn at the hem, her face marked by sun and wind, yet her eyes sharp as she inspects onions at one stall and apples at another, her fingers quick to press for firmness, her voice low but certain as she bargains for fairness. And though she counts each coin with care, her purchases are not only practical but loving. For every onion in her basket will flavor a stew. Every apple will be sliced and shared at her table. And behind each choice lies the thought of her family, of children waiting at home, of a husband returning from the fields. And in her careful shopping there is dignity, resilience, and the quiet rhythm of survival. Stay with me, because in a moment you will notice another buyer, a traveling craftsman with leather pouch at his side, his boots dusted from miles of road, his shoulders wrapped in a patched cloak, and he stops at the stall of the tanner to purchase straps for his tools, at the blacksmith's to buy nails and hinges, and as he haggles and jokes, his voice carries a freedom not always known to villagers. For his life is lived in movement, his needs simple but essential, and yet he too is bound by the same trust in fair scales, in honest weights, in the warmth of bread to keep him strong, and his presence reminds others that the market is a meeting of paths, not just a gathering of neighbors, but a weaving of strangers into the life of the town. Breathe again, and turn to the group of children darting through the crowd, their laughter high and bright, clutching small coins given by parents, and with those coins they deliberate endlessly, hovering at the baker's tray of honey cakes, pointing at the confectioner's sugared nuts, their eyes shining at the chance to buy something sweet that feels like a treasure. And in their joy the market becomes not only a place of necessity but of delight, a place where childhood memories are formed, where the taste of a single sweet lingers in memory long after the day has ended. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see the noblewoman who arrives with attendants, her gown finer than most, though dust still clings to its hem, her gloved hand lifting bolts of cloth at the weaver's stall, her steward weighing spices, her maid inspecting jewelry. And though her purse is heavier than most, her presence is less about necessity and more about display. For buying here is also a performance of status, a reminder to all that her household has wealth enough to purchase silks, to flavor meats with saffron, to set a table gleaming with pewter. And yet, even in her refinement, she too participates in the same ritual, stepping into the same square, exchanging the same words of bargaining, her grandeur softened by the closeness of the crowd. Breathe softly, and notice to the priest moving quietly through the market, his black robe brushing the ground, his eyes steady as he stops at the apothecary for herbs, at the candle-makers for wax, at the bakers for loaves. And though his purchases may be simple, his presence carries weight, a reminder of the church's constant thread through daily life, its authority present even in the hum of trade. And villagers greet him with bows or blessings, for his shopping is never only his own, but also for the chapel, for the candles to be lit in devotion, for the sick who wait for healing, for the altar to be dressed with care. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll hear the voices of poorer buyers, those with only a handful of coins or a few goods to barter. Their choice is limited, their bargaining careful, and yet their presence just as vital. For the market was not only for the wealthy but for all, and in the mingling of rich and poor, neighbor and stranger, noble and peasant, the square became a place of equality, where all stood shoulder to shoulder, seeking, choosing, hoping. Breathe again, and let us follow the pilgrim who has walked for days with badge on his cloak, his staff in hand, his steps weary yet steady, and though he has little to spend, he pauses to buy bread and ale, to rest at the edge of the square. And as others gather near to hear his tales of distant shrines and holy relics, he offers, in exchange for their kindness, the gift of story, of wonder, of connection beyond the town's horizon. And in this way he buys not with coin but with words, his presence enriching the square as surely as any spice merchant's wares. Stay with me, for in a moment you will notice the way buyers interacted with one another as much as with sellers. Neighbors discussing harvests as they compared apples, women exchanging recipes as they chose herbs, men debating weather as they examined grain, children showing each other their purchases, laughter and chatter weaving through the crowd, so that buying was not only transaction but conversation, not only need but community, and the market became not just a place of exchange but of belonging. Breathe softly and see how each buyer, whether wealthy or poor, young or old, noble or humble, carried away more than goods, carried away connection, memory, story, and how their steps leaving the square trailed threads of the market back into cottages, into halls, into churches, weaving the life of the town together. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the true wealth of the market lay not in the coins collected or the goods sold, but in the shared humanity of its buyers, in their hopes and needs, in the dignity of their choices, in the way they turned a simple square of cobblestones into a living mirror of society, where every person, no matter their station, found a place. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself walking among them, your own small purse in hand, choosing carefully, feeling the weight of a loaf, the smoothness of cloth, the scent of herbs, and carrying your basket home not only heavier with goods but lighter with joy, with the sense of having belonged, of having participated in the quiet miracle of community. And know that in the next chapter we will look even closer at the exchange itself, the coins, the bartering, the subtle gestures that turned desire into possession, showing us how trade shaped lives in ways both seen and unseen. And now, as the market swells with buyers and sellers and the hum of voices drifts like a tide across the square, let us pause to observe more closely the heart of the market itself, the act of exchange, for here lies the quiet dance that made everything possible, the moment when want and supply met, when hands extended, when words softened or sharpened, when coins glinted or goods passed hand to hand, and though each trade was small, together they formed the rhythm of the entire day, a pulse that kept the market alive, steady as a heartbeat. Breathe softly with me, and imagine the glint of coins in the sunlight, small discs of copper, silver, and on rare occasions gold, worn smooth by countless exchanges, carried in pouches tied to belts, or knotted in cloth tucked away in sleeves, their faint clink a constant undertone to the market's song. And see how a farmer's wife counts them carefully, one by one, before pressing them into the baker's palm, the baker nodding in acknowledgement before placing a warm loaf into her basket. And though the gesture is simple, it carries centuries of meaning, a trust in the coin's weight, in its promise of value, in the unseen authority of king and kingdom that guarantees its worth. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see that not every exchange was made with coin, for barter still held a place, especially among those with fewer coins to spare. And so, at one stall, a woman offers a bundle of flax in exchange for a length of wool, while nearby a man trades a jug of honey for a small pouch of salt. And these exchanges, sealed with nods and smiles, carry with them not only goods but relationships. For barter is built upon trust, upon mutual respect, upon the quiet knowledge that one person's surplus can ease another's need. And in this way, the market weaves bonds stronger than any coin could forge. Breathe again, and let us notice the gestures that accompanied these exchanges. The subtle dance of hands and eyes, the buyer pausing to inspect, the seller leaning forward to explain, the buyer turning as if to leave, the seller calling back with a softer price. And though words filled the air, it was these gestures, these silences, these pauses that truly shaped the bargain. A performance known by all, acted out 1,000 times. Its rhythm as familiar as prayer, and even when no coin changed hands. The ritual itself brought satisfaction, for both buyer and seller knew the script, and in playing their parts, they affirmed their place in the market's order. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how trust itself was tested and maintained. For scales stood at many stalls, wooden or iron, their arms balanced delicately, small weights of brass or stone placed carefully upon them. And each measurement was a reassurance, a visible proof that the grain poured, the wool weighed, the spice counted, was fair and true. And villagers gathered close to watch, nodding in agreement. For the market depended on this fairness, and though disputes sometimes rose a loaf to light, a measure too small, they were settled quickly, often with the bailiff's quiet intervention, his presence restoring calm, his authority reinforcing the delicate trust that underpinned every transaction. Breathe softly, and imagine to the sound of coins passing hand to hand, the metallic chimes softened by skin, the way fingers brushed briefly as payment was given. A fleeting connection between two strangers, unremarkable and yet intimate, binding them for that instant in shared acknowledgement of need met, of hunger fed, of warmth purchased. And though the moment passed quickly, its echo lingered, a reminder that trade was not only economic but deeply human. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how even the act of haggling carried dignity. For though voices might rise, though buyers might protest or sellers shake their heads, beneath it lay respect, a shared understanding that the dance was necessary, that both sides sought fairness, and so when a price was finally agreed upon, it was not merely a victory for one side, but a harmony found between both, a balance that left each with a sense of rightness, of order, of peace. Breathe again, and let us drift toward the tavern at the square's edge, where ale is poured and debts are settled, not only with coin, but with promises, where men agree to pay next market day, where trust extends beyond the moment, and though not all promises were kept, the very willingness to grant them speaks of community, of the invisible credit line that bound neighbors together, a credit written not on parchment, but on memory, carried from week to week like the tolling of the bell. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice that some exchanges carried more than goods. They carried news, for a man might trade a pouch of grain, but also pass along word of a wedding. A woman might purchase candles, but also hear of sickness in a nearby village. And thus each exchange became a thread in the weaving of communal knowledge. The market not only a place of trade, but a place of memory, where information traveled as swiftly as coin. Breathe softly, and see to the symbolic exchanges, the gifts that passed without expectation of return. A baker slipping an extra roll to a hungry child, a cloth seller cutting a length shorter than paid for, a farmer leaving an apple at the church steps for the poor, and though small, these gestures reminded all that the market was not only about survival, but about generosity, about grace, about kindness woven into the daily rhythm. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the act of exchange in a medieval market was never merely the mechanical movement of coin for goods, but a ritual layered with trust, with performance, with community, with memory, so that every trade carried meaning beyond itself. And in these quiet acts, the market became not just an economic space, but a human one, a place where fairness, dignity, and generosity were rehearsed and reinforced each week. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing with a coin in hand, feeling its smooth weight, hearing its faint clink against another, seeing the smile of the seller as they place a small parcel into your basket, and feel how much more than goods has passed between you, how the simple act of exchange has bound you, briefly but surely, into the life of the square, into the life of the town, into the shared breadth of community, and carry that sense with you as we move in the next chapter from the moment of exchange itself to the broader economy it supported, to the way markets connected not only buyers and sellers, but villages and towns, kingdoms and continents, weaving the threads of a medieval world that reached far beyond the cobblestones beneath our feet. And now, my friend, as we linger in the hum of exchange and the soft clink of coins, let us take a step back from the single square, lifting our gaze beyond the stalls and cobbles to see the larger web into which the market was woven. For a medieval market was never an isolated place, no matter how small or modest its town might have seemed, but part of a living network of trade that stretched outward like threads of a tapestry, connecting villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities to kingdoms, until the goods laid out before us, whether bolts of cloth, sacks of grain, or fragrant spices, could tell stories not only of local fields, but of distant mountains, harbors, and lands far beyond the reach of most who gathered here. Breathe softly with me, and imagine the road that leads into the square, muddy in rain, dusty in summer, lined with hedges and fields, carrying wagons and carts, pack horses and weary feet. For this road does not end at the town's gate, but stretches on, linking to another road, another town, another market, until a chain of exchanges binds one community to another, so that wool shorn from sheep in one village may be spun in another, dyed in a third, woven in a fourth, and sold in a fifth, each step adding value, each place contributing labor, until at last it lies folded on a stall before eager hands. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how grain traveled, harvested in broad fields, stored in barns, measured into sacks, and carried by riverboats downstream to towns in need. For rivers were as vital as roads, their waters bearing barges heavy with goods, moving more swiftly than any ox-drawn cart, their banks alive with warehouses, mills, and taverns where boatmen paused, and in this way markets by rivers thrived, their squares filled with goods brought from far along the water's winding course, each wave a messenger of trade. Breathe again and think of salt, so simple yet so precious, cut from mines or gathered from coastal pans, its crystals essential not only for flavor but for preserving food, carried in barrels or sacks, its presence in a landlocked market a sign of long journeys, of caravans trudging slowly from coast to inland town, and every grain of it whispered of distant seas, of tides far beyond the cobblestones under our feet. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how cloth and wool tied markets together most strongly. For England's wool was famed across Europe, shipped through ports to Flanders where looms never rested, where spinners and dyers transformed fleece into fine cloth, and from there it travelled back again, resold at fairs, carried inland to towns where its sheen dazzled villagers, so that what began as a sheep grazing on a hillside might end as a bolt of fabric in a distant square. And in this cycle wealth flowed, shaping kingdoms, feeding treasuries, funding wars, though here, in our gentle market, its meaning was quieter. A cloak to keep a family warm, a blanket to cradle a child. Breathe softly, and let us wander further outward, beyond rivers and hills, to the ports where merchants loaded ships bound for warmer seas, where spices from the east cinnamon, cloves arrived after long, perilous voyages, carried first on camel trains across deserts, then on ships across waters, then unloaded into warehouses, passed hand to hand until a tiny pouch reached our small square. And though most here could never dream of the journey, the mere presence of those spices told them they lived in a world far larger than their own horizon. A world linked by invisible threads of trade, woven together across continents. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how fairs served as great knots in this web. Larger gatherings held once or twice a year, lasting for days or weeks, drawing merchants from across regions, where debts were settled, contracts written, coins exchanged in great volume. And from those fairs goods radiated outward again, flowing into smaller markets, so that even those who never left their village could feel the echo of distant fairs in the goods they touched. Breathe again, and imagine to the roads of trust that paralleled the roads of stone. For merchants relied not only on wagons and ships, but on relationships, on credit extended, on promises made and kept, on networks of families and guilds that stretched across towns, so that a merchant in one place could trust a partner in another to sell his goods, to hold his coin, to send him fair news. And these bonds, though unseen, were as strong as iron chains, binding the medieval economy together. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how even knowledge travelled with goods. A merchant telling of new farming tools he saw in another town. A pilgrim describing vineyards beyond the mountains. A craftsman explaining how dye was made richer in a distant city. And these words passed from ear to ear, carrying innovation, changing practices, shaping the future quietly, so that markets were not only centers of exchange, but of learning, where ideas slipped into villages as softly as spices slipped into stews. Breathe softly, and let us not forget the role of coin in this larger web, for the pennies and groats exchanged here were minted under kings, their weight guaranteed by royal authority, and these coins travelled too, changing hands in countless towns, their faces worn smooth, their journeys untraceable yet vast, so that a coin given in one village might months later buy goods in a distant fair, its value connecting distant strangers who would never meet, each trusting the small circle of metal as if it were a promise whispered from afar. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that every loaf, every bolt, every pouch of spice in a market square was not merely an object, but the end point of a story, a journey across fields, rivers, seas, and hands, and that markets, though they seemed small and ordinary, were in truth crossroads of the world, where the local and the global touched, where the cobblestones of a village square met the dust of desert roads, the spray of ocean waves, the clang of city looms. And in this meeting, ordinary people were quietly part of something vast, something timeless. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself holding a simple item from the market-arn apple, a piece of cloth, a pinch of salt, and then picture the journey it has taken to reach you. The hands that grew it, carried it, weighed it, sold it. The roads and rivers it has traveled, the worlds it has connected. And feel the wonder that such a simple thing holds within it a history of movement, of connection, of unseen ties binding you to people far beyond your sight. And carry that sense with you as we move into the next chapter, where we will look not outward but inward, at the guilds and communities of craftsmen who shape the market from within, giving it not only goods, but structure, identity, and pride. And now, my friend, let us slip quietly into the heart of the market's order, into the circles of craft and skill that gave the square its structure and its dignity. For though the market might appear at first glance as a wild patchwork of stalls and voices, behind its noise and color lay the steady hands of guilds, those associations of craftsmen and merchants who shaped the rhythm of trade, who guarded the fairness of work, and who passed on knowledge like a candle flame from one generation to the next. And as you breathe softly with me, you may see how without these guilds the market would have been chaos. But with them it became something closer to harmony, a place where craft carried both pride and responsibility. Imagine first the guild of bakers, their ovens glowing in back rooms that fed the square each morning, their members bound not only by the need to bake, but by rules of quality and weight, ensuring that no loaf sold was too light, no flour mixed with false measure. And their guildmaster, stern yet fatherly, inspecting loaves at dawn, nodding in approval when he found them sound, frowning when he did not, and so each crust carried not only warmth but trust, each crumb whispering of shared standards. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see the Weavers' Guild, their looms clattering in workshops nearby, their apprentices leaning close to masters, learning how threads must lie, how colors must blend, how patterns must repeat with care. And in the square their stalls stood proudly, bolts folded neatly, marked with the seal of their guild, a small sign of authority that told buyers these goods were not haphazard, but bore the mark of craft honed by years. Breathe again, and let us move to the blacksmith's guild, whose forges rang day and night, sparks leaping like fireflies into the smoky air, their hammers shaping not only plowshares and nails, but horseshoes and hinges, swords and candlesticks, every piece inspected, every piece declared true by the guild, so that when a villager bought an iron tool he knew it would not break at first use, but endure, and that endurance was the pride of the smiths. Stay with me, for in a moment you will notice the shoemaker's guild, leather stretched and stitched in dim workshops that smelled of hide and tallow, apprentices bent over their benches, awls in hand, and their finished shoes lined the stalls, strong, dependable, each one shaped by standards agreed upon by the guild. And though the buyer might never see the rules written in their charter, he felt them in the sturdiness of each step he took. Breathe softly, and let us remember the Carpenter's Guild, too, who built the very stalls we walk among, who raised beams for houses, frames for doors, tables for homes, and whose mark on timber was itself a guarantee, a quiet promise that what they built would stand through storms and years. And so the market was not merely filled with goods, but supported, structured, and guaranteed by these guilds, their presence invisible yet constant, like the beams hidden within the roof. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how guilds were not only economic but communal, for they gathered together in halls, shared meals, drank from common cups, prayed at the same altars, and when one member fell ill, others came to his aid. When one died, they carried him to rest. And so guilds were families as much as institutions, their bonds extending beyond work into life itself. And these bonds gave strength not only to craftsmen, but to the town as a whole. Breathe again and imagine the apprentices, young boys just beginning their path, sweeping workshops, running errands, slowly learning the weight of tools, the patience of hands, the secrets of craft, their eyes bright with the hope of mastery. And then the journeyman, older, skilled, traveling from town to town, seeking work, testing their knowledge against new challenges. And finally the masters, proud and steady, holding not only skill but the right to teach, to employ, to sell under the guild's name. And in this structure, repeated in guild after guild, craft was preserved, improved, and passed along, ensuring that the market would never lack for skill. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how guilds also defended their members against unfairness, standing together if taxes grew heavy, if outsiders tried to undercut them, if false goods threatened their reputation. And through their unity they protected not only themselves but the integrity of the market, ensuring that what was sold was honest, that the trust of buyers was never betrayed. And so the guilds acted as guardians, invisible but powerful, their presence felt in every transaction. Breathe softly and think too of the guilds of merchants, broader still, who controlled the great flows of goods, who negotiated with rulers, who set prices at fairs, who ensured that trade routes remained open. And while the humble craftsman in the square might not see their hand directly, he felt it in the stability of his sales, in the predictability of supplies, in the safety of roads traveled by caravans. Stay with me, because in a moment you will notice the rituals of the guilds, the banners carried in processions on holy days, the candles lit at guild altars, the feasts held in long halls with laughter, song, and fellowship. And these rituals, though joyous, were also binding, reminders that each member's work was not his alone, but part of a greater body. And in serving the guild, he served his craft, his town, and his God. Breathe again, and imagine the pride of a craftsman placing his work upon the stall, not merely as an individual, but as a representative of his guild, his livelihood guaranteed by its name, his skill sharpened by its standards, and the buyer, in turn, confident that what he purchased bore not only the hand of a single worker, but the collective assurance of an entire brotherhood. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the goods we see in the market, the bread, the cloth, the shoes, the tools, are not only products of hands and labor, but of communities of craft, of guilds that wove fairness, pride, and solidarity into each object, so that every purchase carried not only usefulness, but meaning, a connection to a tradition, to a fellowship, to a structure that preserved skill across generations. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, picture yourself walking through the market, not as a stranger, but as a guest among guilds. Each stall a doorway into a world of skill. Each purchase a handshake with centuries of tradition. Each craftsman a link in a chain stretching backward and forward through time, and feel the warmth of belonging. The reassurance that what you hold in your hands was shaped with care, with pride, with dignity. And let that comfort settle within you as we move gently into the next chapter, where we will look beyond the guilds to the rhythms of feast and fast, of holy days and celebrations, and see how the calendar itself shaped the life of the market, guiding its moods, its colors, its offerings, through the turning of the seasons. And now, my friend, as we settle deeper into the life of the market, Let us turn our attention to the rhythm that guided not only the stalls and the coins, but the very pulse of the entire community, the rhythm of feast and fast, of holy days and celebrations. For in the medieval world, the calendar was not merely a series of dates, but a living pattern, woven through with sacred times that touched every part of life. And as you breathe softly with me, you will see how the market square shifted with these days, sometimes swelling with abundance, sometimes quieting in restraint, always moving in harmony with the church bells that tolled above. Imagine first the ordinary week, steady and unremarkable, with the market buzzing in its usual hum, bread on tables, cloth folded in stacks, fish glistening in barrels. Yet then picture how it changed when a feast day approached, how colours seemed to spill suddenly across the stalls, with ribbons in brighter hues, candles moulded in extra shapes, sweetmeats dusted with sugar, and small trinkets of wood or pewter shaped as crosses, saints, or charms, all offered to buyers eager to prepare their homes and families for celebration. And the air itself seemed lighter, filled with expectation, voices rising not in haste but in joy, laughter louder, coins more freely given, and stay with me, for in a moment you will see the fast days too, quieter and more solemn, when meat vanished from tables, replaced by fish and grains, when sellers lowered their voices, when buyers carried themselves with gentler steps. For fasting was not absence but discipline, a reminder of shared devotion. And even in this restraint, the market did not fade but adapted, becoming a mirror of faith as much as of commerce. Breathe again, and imagine the great feasts of Christmas and Easter, when the market brimmed with life beyond measure, stalls crowded with greenery for decoration, wreaths of holly, sprigs of ivy, tables piled with spiced bread, honey cakes, roasted chestnuts, small gifts of carved wood, and wax candles gleaming in the pale winter sun. And in Easter season, eggs dyed with natural colours, lamb-shaped pastries, bright fabrics to greet the spring, and the people themselves clothed in their finest, their faces radiant. For the feast was not only at the altar but in the square, and to walk through the market on those days was to walk through a tide of joy, a sea of voices lifted in song, gossip and anticipation. And though goods mattered, what mattered most was the feeling of abundance, of shared delight, of sacred times spilling into ordinary streets. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how saints' days shaped the market as well, each town honouring its own patron, with stalls offering tokens, badges, or small relics, pilgrims arriving to buy bread and ale, inns crowded, bells ringing long into the night. And here the market was not only a place of exchange, but of welcome, a host to visitors who brought news, songs, and sometimes foreign coins, their presence weaving the local into the universal, the small town into the great church of Christendom. Breathe softly and picture the Lenten weeks, when fasting grew stricter, when no meat was sold, when the fish stalls multiplied, barrels of herring and cod arriving from distant coasts. And though the mood was quieter, even sombre, it was not heavy but peaceful, a collective pause, a way for the town to draw breath, to remember patience and humility. And still the market square thrummed gently, with its sounds softened, its goods adapted, its rhythm aligned with prayer. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how fairs often tied themselves to holy days, for practical reasons and spiritual ones. And so the feast of a saint became the occasion for merchants from far away to gather, their wares mingling with local goods, their tents pitched just outside the square, their voices foreign, their goods exotic. And the holy day became not only a moment of devotion, but of prosperity, of connection, of the town opening its arms to the wider world. And in this blend of sacred and worldly, the market found its truest self. Breathe again, and imagine how even small rhythms of the week mattered. The quietness of Sunday when stalls closed, streets emptied, and bells called the town to church. The stillness like a held breath, broken only by distant footsteps and the faint murmur of prayer. And then, come Monday, the square opening again with renewed energy, as though silence itself had given the market strength, and this cycle of silence and sound, of pause and return, gave the market its steady pulse, as reliable as the sun's rising. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how the people themselves felt these rhythms, not as burdens, but as comforts, for they marked the turning of time, giving shape to seasons, anchoring life in patterns both sacred and familiar, so that even the poorest villager, with few coins and little to spare, could share in the joy of feast or the calm of fast. And in this sharing, community was born again each week, each month, each year. Breathe softly and notice how the senses shifted with these rhythms. On feast days, the smell of roasted meats, sugared almonds, and mulled ale filled the air. Colors bright and bold, laughter spilling over, bells ringing with abandon, while on fast days the scents were simpler. Fish salted and plain, vegetables stewing, bread coarser, voices lower, and bells tolling slower, deeper. And in this ebb and flow, the market became like breathing. Inhale and exhale, fullness and restraint, joy and reflection, weaving balance into the lives of all who pass through it. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the market was not only shaped by economics or craft, but by the sacred rhythm of time itself, that its very character shifted with the church's calendar, so that the stalls we walked among were never static but alive, changing with feast and fast, echoing devotion as much as desire. And in this harmony of commerce and faith lay the secret of its endurance, for it was not only a place of goods, but a place of spirit, carrying both body and soul through the turning year. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself walking through the market on the eve of a great feast, the air bright with music and light, your hands full of small purchases, your heart full of expectation. And then imagine the same square weeks later in the calm of Lent, its air scented with fish and smoke, its voices softer, its pace slower, and in both scenes feel the same comfort, the same belonging, the same sense of being held in rhythm. And carry that peace with you as we move into the next chapter, where we will look more closely at the food itself, at the meals that sprang from these markets, and how bread, fish, meat, and spice found their way from stalls to tables, feeding families and shaping the taste of medieval life. And now, my friend, as we walk once more beneath the awnings and past the chatter of merchants, let us turn our eyes and hearts toward the food itself, toward the bread and the fish, the meats and the spices, the fruits and vegetables that filled baskets and bellies, for it is through food that the market touched every home most intimately, shaping not only the meals on tables, but the rhythm of family life, the comfort of hunger answered, the joy of feast shared. And as you breathe softly with me, you may notice first the bread, for bread was the anchor of the medieval diet, baked daily in round loaves, some coarse and heavy for the poor, some lighter, whiter, reserved for wealthier tables, and each loaf in the market carried the warmth of ovens, the crackle of crust, the soft promise of sustenance. And buyers tested its weight, pressed its side gently, inhaled its scent before handing over their coins. For bread was not only food but life itself, the measure of stability in a home. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how fish too was ever present, drawn from rivers, lakes, or salted from the sea. Sold fresh when possible, but often preserved in barrels of brine. And though its taste might be simple, it held great importance, especially on fasting days when meat was forbidden. And the fishmongers' stalls gleamed with scales catching the light, their barrels pungent yet reassuring, for they carried the sea into the square, a link between inland towns and distant coasts. Breathe again and imagine the meat stalls, less frequent than bread or fish, but vital, with cuts of pork, mutton, and beef laid out upon wooden boards, their sale regulated by both guild and church, their presence in the market a sign of prosperity, for meat was dear, often reserved for feast days or special occasions, and buyers came with care, measuring their coin against their hunger, and sometimes choosing bones or offal rather than rich cuts. Yet even these, boiled into stews with onions, leeks, or cabbage, brought warmth and strength to a table, proving that nothing of the animal was wasted. Stay with me, for in a moment you will notice the cheeses and butters, small wheels wrapped in cloth, pats of butter pressed into wooden molds, their scent rich, their taste sharp or mild depending on their age. And these dairy goods travelled well, keeping longer than milk itself. And so they were prized by villagers who could not keep cows or goats of their own. And every slice upon bread or crumble into a pottage was a luxury of flavour, a small piece of comfort. Breathe softly, and let us linger at the stalls of fruits and vegetables, their colours bright against the grey cobblestones, apples and pears, onions and garlic, beans and peas, carrots, turnips, cabbages, each tied to its season, each reminding the town of the cycle of harvest, the patience of soil, the care of farmers, and though winter might bring scarcity, still some roots remained stored in cellars, some apples preserved, and in summer the abundance overflowed. Baskets heavy with cherries, plums, and berries, each bite a taste of sunlight captured in sweetness. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see the role of grain, not only in bread, but in barley and oats, ground into flour, boiled into porridge, brewed into ale. For grain was the backbone of diet, versatile, filling, and though it seemed plain, it fed both peasant and lord, its presence steady, its absence dreaded. And in the market sacks of grain stood tall, their contents measured out by scoop, their price watched closely, for when grain rose to dear, hunger followed, and unrest could stir, reminding all of the fragile balance of plenty and want. Breathe again, and imagine the small luxuries that brightened tables, honey sold in comb or jar, its sweetness treasured, eggs gathered in baskets, both fragile and rich, herbs tied in bundles, parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, their scent sharp, their flavour lifting simple stews into something memorable. And even salt, so common to us now, was in the market a treasure, for it preserved meat, it seasoned every dish, it symbolized hospitality, and its presence reminded the town of distant mines or seas where it was gathered with labor and care. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice the spices, rare and costly, yet present in small packets for those with coin to spare. Pepper black as night, cinnamon curled in fragrant sticks, saffron golden as fire, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger. And though only the wealthy could buy them often, their scent drifted through the market, carried by merchants' displays, a whisper of far-off lands, a promise of flavor beyond the ordinary, and even those who could not afford them might stand close, breathing deeply, imagining the taste, dreaming of tables richer than their own. Breathe softly, and let us move from stalls to kitchens. For what was bought in the market soon simmered in pots, baked in ovens, roasted on spits, and the meals themselves reflected the rhythm of life. Thick pottages made from grains, beans, and vegetables, flavored with scraps of meat when possible. Fresh bread eaten with cheese or butter. Ale poured into wooden cups, its bitterness familiar and comforting. Stews rich with onions and leeks, warming in winter. Pies filled with fruits in summer. And on feast days, roasts with herbs, spiced cakes, sugared almonds, and the rare delights of imported figs or raisins. And in every meal was the mark of the market, its goods transformed by fire, by hands, by care, into nourishment and joy. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how even the poorest tables carried dignity. Though the food might be plain, the bread dark, the pottage thin, still it filled bellies. Still it carried the blessing of labor. Still it tied families together in shared bowls. And the market made this possible, its hum carrying into kitchens, its goods feeding not only bodies but spirits. For to eat together was to belong, to find comfort in company, to share in the rhythm of community. Breathe again and think of the ways food itself marked time. The lighter meals of summer, the heavier stews of winter, the fresh greens of spring, the preserved stores of autumn, and within each season the market shifted, reflecting the bounty or the scarcity, reminding all of the turning year, of dependence on land, on weather, on God's grace. And so the meals of a household were never separate from the rhythms of nature and faith, but part of them, stitched together by what the market offered. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice to the social side of food, how taverns by the market filled with laughter as ale flowed, how travellers bought pies or bread to eat along the road, how feast days drew families into squares where food was sold not only to take home but to eat in the moment. Hot cakes, roasted nuts, steaming bowls of stew served by vendors. And in these moments food became celebration, a bond shared not only with kin but with neighbor, stranger, and friend alike. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that food in the medieval market was not simply sustenance, not merely survival, but connection, a thread weaving through family life, community gatherings, religious observance, seasonal rhythms, and even dreams of distant lands, so that each bite carried more than flavor. It carried meaning, memory, and hope, and the market, in its hum and color, was the stage upon which these daily miracles unfolded. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself holding a small loaf warm in your hands, tearing it gently, steam rising into the cool air, and then dipping it into a bowl of pottage, flavored with herbs, humble yet rich. And as you taste it, feel not only the food itself, but the entire market within it, the baker's hands, the farmer's labor, the merchant's travel, the guild's protection, the church's rhythm, and let that warmth fill you, body and soul, before we move onward into the next chapter, where we will leave the table and turn to the crafts beyond food, to the stalls of cloth, wood, leather, and metal, to see how goods shaped not only bellies but the very fabric of medieval life. And now, my friend, as we step gently beyond the food stalls, the scent of bread and herbs fading slowly into memory, let us wander deeper into the market where other goods wait, where cloth, wood, leather, and metal fill the square with color and texture, with the promise not of a meal but of warmth, shelter, and craft for these wares to shape medieval life, weaving themselves into every household, every journey, every daily task. And as you breathe softly with me, you will see how each material carried its own story, its own journey from raw matter to finished piece, and how each reflected the pride of hands that labored in patience and skill. Imagine first the stalls of cloth, their awnings bright with folded bolts in deep hues of red, green, blue, and the softer shades of undyed wool. The fabric neatly stacked, its edges weighted by stones to keep it from the breeze, and buyers reach out to run fingers along its weave, feeling the tightness or looseness of thread, judging its strength, its softness, its worth. And some cloth has traveled from local looms, spun in cottages and dyed with plants gathered from fields, while others come from distant towns, finer, smoother, touched with more vibrant colors, their price higher, their allure greater, and each piece tells a story of sheep grazing, of spinners working by candlelight, of vats of dye steaming in courtyards, of weavers' feet pressing pedals in rhythm, until the cloth before us carries not only color but hours, days, months of quiet labor. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how garments to hang here, tunics and cloaks, hoods and gowns, some plain, some trimmed with fur, some embroidered with threads that glimmer faintly in the light. And though the fashions may seem simple, each garment represents dignity, comfort, and identity, for clothing spoke of rank, of wealth, of community, and to walk through the market in new cloth was to walk in pride, to be seen as cared for, as honorable, as part of the larger order of society. Breathe again, and let us drift toward the carpenter's stalls, where wood has been shaped into objects both humble and fine, bowls turned smooth on lathes, spoons carved with care, benches sturdy and plain, small boxes with simple hinges, and sometimes larger goods displayed at the edges of the square doors. Shutters, tables brought here more to advertise skill than to sell on the spot. And the scent of wood lingers in the air, fresh and clean, a reminder of forests beyond the town, of trees felled and seasoned, of sawdust clinging to workshops, and each piece bears the mark of hand tools, of chisels and planes, of patient strokes shaping grain into use and beauty, so that when a buyer takes a spoon into hand, he feels not only its smoothness, but the care behind it. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice the leather, their stalls filled with belts and shoes, gloves and pouches, their hides dyed in rich browns and blacks, polished to a soft sheen, the smell of tanned leather strong but pleasing, a scent of durability, of journeys yet to come, and each piece stitched with strong cord, tested for strength, for leather was trusted to last, to carry coins safely, to guard feet on long roads, to strap tools at the waist, and even small children gazed at the shoes with wonder. For a new pair was a mark of fortune, a sign of readiness for seasons ahead. Breathe softly, and let us not pass too quickly by the stalls of smiths, their goods gleaming faintly, nails piled in small bags, knives sharpened to a clean edge, hinges, locks, candlesticks, and sometimes tool spades, axes, hammers all laid carefully on boards. Their iron weight speaking of strength, their forms simple yet essential, and the smith himself often stood proudly behind, his hands blackened still from forge, his chest broad from years of hammering, his eyes sharp, for he knew each piece he sold carried his reputation, his honor. And though these goods might lack the color of cloth or the fragrance of herbs, they carried an appeal of their own. The appeal of permanence, of utility, of work made solid and enduring. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how these four crafts, wood, leather, metal, wove together to shape lives in ways so constant they often went unseen. For from cloth came the warmth of garments, from wood the shelter of tables and tools, from leather the strength of shoes and belts, from metal the endurance of locks and nails, and together they formed the fabric of daily existence, silent but indispensable, binding the home and the town into a whole. Breathe again and imagine the process behind them. For every piece in the square carried echoes of labor. Sheep sheared in spring, their wool washed and carded, spun on wheels, dyed with woad or madder, woven into fabric. Trees felled with care, logs dried, sawn into planks, shaped into bowls or beams. Hides scraped, soaked, stretched, tanned with bark, softened, cut, stitched, or mined from the earth, smelted in fire, hammered into shape, cooled and sharpened, and each step required time, patience, skill, and so each object in the market was more than a thing, it was a record of time, a story told through craft. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how these goods reflected not only need but aspiration. For to own finer cloth, a carved chest, a polished knife, was to rise in standing, to show one's household as secure, as respectable. And so the market was not merely a place of survival, but of dreams, of hope, of striving for better, and in this striving lay much of its quiet beauty. Breathe softly, and let us see to the interactions between crafts. Leather straps fastened wooden chests, metal buckles joined belts, cloth was cut with iron shears, garments stitched with wooden needles tipped in bone, and so no craft stood alone but all intertwined, each supporting and enriching the others, their products mingling on tables, their makers nodding to one another across stalls, knowing that their work together made life whole. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how children too felt the wonder of these crafts, their small hands reaching out to touch the smooth wood of a toy, the soft fur trim on a hood, the gleam of a little bell. And though parents often pulled them back, smiling at their eagerness, they too remembered the joy of touching, of imagining ownership. And in these moments the market planted seeds of appreciation, of desire, of future craft, for perhaps one child, years later, would join the guild of weavers, or smiths, or carvers, drawn by memories first formed in the square. Breathe again, and notice the dignity carried by craftsmen. For though some were humble, their work overlooked, they stood in the market with pride, their goods laid out as proof of skill, their voices soft but steady as they explained, bargained, promised. And in those moments they were not merely sellers but keepers of tradition, transmitters of knowledge older than themselves, and their presence lent the market a foundation as solid as stone. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the stalls of cloth, Wood, leather, and metal were more than arrays of goods. They were glimpses into the heart of labor, into the patience of hands, into the continuity of craft across generations, and that every object we see carries not only use but meaning, not only form but memory, a reminder that human life has always been shaped by the marriage of necessity and beauty, of survival and pride. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing at a stall, running your hand over smooth fabric, then lifting a wooden bowl, smelling the rich scent of leather, feeling the weight of iron in your palm. And in that moment you are not merely a buyer, but a witness to centuries of craft, a link in the endless chain of hands that shape, sell, buy, and use. And let this awareness settle like a blanket of comfort over you as we move into the next chapter, where we will turn our attention from goods themselves to the people who carried them, the travelers and merchants, the wanderers and pilgrims, who brought the market its richness by their very coming and going. And now, dear friend, as we move gently through the market stalls, let us pause to notice not only the goods themselves, but the people who carried them here, the travelers and merchants, the pilgrims and wanderers, for without them the square would not have its hum, its color, its shifting tides of voices. And as you breathe softly with me, you will see that each stranger who arrived at the town gate brought not only wares, but also stories, news, and glimpses of a wider world. And in this way, the market was as much about movement as about trade, as much about journey as about purchase. And to linger among these travelers is to feel the living pulse of connection. Imagine first the merchant with his cart piled high, wheels creaking as oxen strain against the load, sacks of grain tied tight, barrels of ale wedged firm, bolts of cloth cushioned by straw, and he steps down into the square, back stiff from the road, hands calloused from rains, yet his eyes bright, for here he will find coin, conversation, and rest. And he greets fellow traders with nods, speaking in low tones of prices, weather, and roads. And though his goods may be heavy, his spirit is lightened by the company of others who share his wandering life. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see the smaller trader, a peddler with goods strapped to his back, his pack filled with pins, combs, beads, and ribbons. Items small but alluring, and he walks lightly, weaving through crowds, calling softly, opening his pack to reveal bright trinkets that catch children's eyes, and though each sale is small, together they make his living, his coins jingling faintly in his pouch, his life measured in steps taken from town to town. Breathe again, and imagine the pilgrim, cloak dusty, staff worn smooth, a badge pinned to his chest, showing the shrine from which he has come. And though he has little to sell, he buys bread, ale, perhaps a candle, and in return he offers stories of holy places, of relics kissed, of miracles whispered. And the townsfolk gather round, listening with reverence, for the pilgrim brings not goods but blessing, not trade but inspiration. And in his presence the market feels touched by something sacred, something larger than commerce. Stay with me, for in a moment you will notice the foreign merchants, their accents lilting, their wares strange, a jug glazed with patterns unknown, a spice sharp on the tongue, a cloth woven finer than local looms could make. And though they are outsiders, the market opens to them, curious eyes watching, cautious hands reaching, coins offered with hesitation but also wonder, for such traders are windows into far-off lands. Their very presence a reminder that the square is linked, two horizons unseen. Breathe softly, And let us follow the drovers who lead animals through the gate, scattle lowing, sheep bleating, pigs squealing as they trot on short legs, and these men, sunburned and strong, carry not trinkets but life itself, animals destined for meat, milk, or wool, and the noise they bring is part of the market's symphony, the sound of commerce, raw and real, and though they may sell quickly and leave, their work sustains the very core of the town's survival. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how the market is also shaped by women traders, carrying baskets of eggs, jugs of milk, bunches of herbs, their presence steady and essential, their voices bargaining with sharpness or kindness, their steps sure even on uneven cobbles, and though history often forgets them, here in the square they are vital, their goods small but indispensable, their earnings feeding households, their presence shaping the market's daily flow. Breathe again and imagine the inns at the edge of the square, their doors wide to welcome weary travellers, straw laid fresh, ale poured foaming, bread broken warm, and in these inns the merchants and pilgrims mingle, sharing tales, counting coins, resting heavy heads. And so the market's life does not end at dusk, but flows into firelit rooms, into laughter and song, into the soft snore of men sleeping side by side, their dreams filled with roads and goods and home. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how these travellers bring news. News of kings' decrees, of battles fought far away, of weather-ruining harvests, of roads blocked by floods or bandits. And such news is as valuable as any good, shaping decisions, guiding choices, and so townsfolk gather eagerly, ears bent, hearts stirred, for in the market they hear not only what to buy, but what to expect from the world beyond their walls. Breathe softly, and let us think of the dangers these travellers faced to reach the square. Muddy roads where wheels stuck fast, forests where robbers lurked, bridges frail or broken, rivers swollen with rain, nights cold and unwelcoming, yet still they came, again and again, their courage woven into the goods they brought, their endurance shaping the very possibility of trade. And though few thought of it while buying bread or cloth, the market itself stood as proof of countless risks endured, countless steps taken across uncertain ground. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how the arrival of travellers turned the market into a place of mingling cultures, where new words slipped into speech, where gestures were learned and imitated, where children gaped at accents, at clothes, at manners, and though some muttered suspicion, others leaned closer with curiosity. And slowly, gently, the town absorbed these influences, becoming richer, more layered, more aware of the world beyond. Breathe again, and imagine to the entertainers who travelled with the traders, jugglers tossing bright balls into the air, minstrels plucking strings and singing songs of distant heroes, dancers twirling scarves, fools making children laugh. And though they sold no goods, they sold joy, they sold wonder, and the market, already filled with bread and cloth, now brimmed also with laughter, with music, with colour, and this too was part of its gift. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll realize the deeper truth, that the market was not only fed by travellers, but defined by them, that without their movement the square would be empty, lifeless, but with them it became alive, a crossroads where lives touched briefly before parting again, each encounter fleeting yet meaningful, each coin exchanged a symbol of journeys that stretched far beyond sight. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the market was as much a place of stories as of goods, that every sack of grain, every bolt of cloth, every trinket or tool was also a tale of distance travelled, of hands passed through, of risks faced, and that to walk through the square was to walk through a living book of journeys. Each merchant, each pilgrim, each peddler, a page in that endless story. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing at the gate of the market as travellers arrive, hearing the creak of carts, the shuffle of feet, the soft jingle of bells on harnesses, and as you watch them enter, tired, yet determined, you feel gratitude, for they have brought not only goods, but connection, not only wares, but meaning. And as the sun sets, you know the market will rise again tomorrow with new voices, new faces, new stories, and we will move in. The next chapter to explore how towns themselves grew around these squares, how markets became the heart from which streets, houses, and even walls unfolded, shaping the very landscape of medieval life. And now, dear friend, let us linger at the edge of the market square and turn our gaze outward. For while the bustle of trade fills the air and the smell of bread and leather, wool and hay surrounds us, it is easy to forget that this square is more than a meeting place, more than a stage for goods and voices. It is the very seed from which the town itself has grown. And as you breathe softly and follow me in thought, you will see how streets, homes, churches, and even walls stretched outward from the heart of the market, so that the life of the town, in its rhythm and shape, owes itself entirely to the weekly gathering of people and trade. Imagine first a clearing where paths crossed, just a simple place where villagers once came to exchange eggs for honey, hides for grain, nothing formal, nothing marked, just earth trampled by feet and hooves. But then, as the exchanges grew, more came, neighbors from farther afield, and the clearing became familiar, a place expected, a place needed. And soon, it was no longer just a patch of ground, but a destination. And in time, someone built a stall, another built a bench, and slowly the outlines of a market square began to form. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how once the market was fixed. Houses began to lean toward it, humble cottages first, then shops with workshops behind, and then inns for travellers. Their doors open to catch the flow of strangers, and the paths that once wandered loosely became streets, straightened by the press of walls, named by the goods that passed along them, such as Baker Street, Tanner Lane, Smith's Row. And though centuries may have passed since then, even now in some towns you can trace these names back to the medieval market at their core. Breathe again, and let us imagine the church rising at one edge of the square, its spire pointing heavenward, its bells marking not only prayer but also the opening of the market. For the sacred and the worldly lived side by side, and merchants spread their cloth and tools even in the shadow of holy walls. And sermons sometimes warned against greed while trade continued below. And so faith and commerce intertwined, each shaping the life of the town in different yet overlapping ways. Stay with me, for in a moment you will notice how wealth from the market allowed stone to replace timber. Thatched roofs gave way to tiles, cottages to larger halls, and soon guild halls stood proudly on corners, built not only for business but for prestige, a mark of permanence, of prosperity, and the town began to shine more brightly. Its buildings speaking of success born from trade. Breathe softly, and think too of the walls that rose around. For with wealth came risk, and merchants and townsfolk alike feared raids, feared thieves, feared the shifting tides of power. And so walls of stone or timber were raised, gates built, towers manned. And within these walls the market was held safe, and the town enclosed itself, protecting the beating heart of its square. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how life itself reorganized around this center. Craftsmen built homes near the market to be close to buyers. Bakers to sell bread still warm, brewers to sell ale still fresh, tailors to stitch clothes while their cloth was still on hand, and each trade nestled near its need, clustering streets by craft, so that one could walk from the square outward and find a lane of shoemakers, another of potters, another of carpenters, and this clustering gave order, gave rhythm, and made the town both practical and alive. Breathe again and imagine the children who grew up in these towns, their games shaped by the market, chasing one another between stalls, sneaking sweet crumbs from bakers, helping parents carry baskets, their childhoods filled with the sound of bells and voices, so that for them the market was not an event but the very background of life, the stage on which their memories were formed. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how even the justice of the town rooted itself here. Proclamations read aloud from steps of stone, punishments sometimes carried out in the square, contracts signed, disputes settled, so that the market was not only the place of buying and selling, but of law and governance, of order and identity, binding the people together under a shared set of rules and customs. Breathe softly, and think also of the fairs that blossomed from markets, larger, grander, drawing crowds from many miles, sometimes lasting days, sometimes weeks, their excitement spilling beyond the usual bounds, with tents pitched outside the walls, musicians playing long into the night, goods arriving from distant ports, and such fairs fed back into the town, enriching it, expanding it, making it a name known on wider maps. And so the town grew not by fields alone, but by reputation, by the gathering of strangers whose coins and stories flowed into its veins. Stay with me, because in a moment you will notice how markets even shaped time itself. For weeks revolved around market day. Rhythms of labor bent toward it, grain ground, bread baked, animals driven in on the morning before, and people counted their lives in these cycles, knowing when to sow, when to reap, when to sell, when to buy. And so the market became the clock of the town, measuring not hours but weeks, not minutes but seasons, its bells and bustle more certain than any calendar. Breathe again and imagine the sounds of construction as the town swelled, hammers striking wood, stones fitted into walls, roofs rising, and with each strike, each lift, the market at the center grew more vital, more secure, more permanent, until the town was no longer just a cluster of buildings, but a world unto itself, a living circle with the square as its heart. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how people themselves changed. For the market gave them more than goods. It gave them identity, pride in being part of a town, pride in belonging to a place recognized by others. And so when strangers asked, "Where are you from?" they no longer said a patch of fields or a nameless lane. They said the name of their market town, and that name carried weight, recognition, connection. And in that moment, identity itself had shifted. Breathe softly, and let us see to the festivals born of markets, the holy days layered with trade, where processions wound through stalls, candles lit in chapels, banners lifted high, and the town became both sacred and festive, its square filled not only with buyers, but with joy, with community, with celebration. And so the market was not simply economic, but spiritual, not only functional, but emotional, the place where hearts gathered as much as hands. Stay with me, because in a moment you will see how, over centuries, some towns grew so rich from their markets that they became cities. Their names etched into chronicles, their influence stretching across regions. And all of this began with a simple gathering in a clearing, with the hum of exchange. With the quiet agreement that, here, in this place, people would meet again and again. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that the towns we know, the cities that still stand today, owe their very bones to markets. That the cobblestones beneath our feet once marked stalls and carts. That the squares we now cross so casually once held the lifeblood of communities. And that to walk through them is to walk through echoes of trade, echoes of voices that long ago chose to gather, to share, to build, and in so doing gave rise to the towns themselves. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing in the square as houses lean close, as streets ripple outward like spokes, as walls rise and bells ring, and you feel the market not as a moment but as a center, a force, a heart, and let this sense of rootedness, of belonging, settle over you like a warm cloak as we prepare to move into the next chapter, where we will explore how markets also drew boundaries of power, how lords, kings, and guilds claimed their place within the square, shaping not only trade but authority itself. And now, my friend, as we walk slowly once more across the cobbles of the market square, let us pause and listen not only to the soft murmur of buyers and sellers, the clink of coins, the creak of carts, but also to the quieter hum of authority, the invisible yet ever-present weight of power that shaped this gathering. For markets were never simply open fields of free exchange. They were always under the shadow of those who claimed control, lords who built castles nearby, kings who sent their charters, guilds that set rules, priests who reminded of conscience. And as you breathe gently with me, you will see that the market was as much about power as it was about bread, and that every trade was bound by permission, every stall by right, every measure by oversight. And in this way the square was a stage not only of goods, but of governance. Imagine first the lord of the manor, his castle stones looming above the town, his men patrolling the gates, his steward walking the market with a tally, collecting dues for the right to sell, to pitch a stall, to bring cattle through. And the buyers and sellers knew that while the square felt free, it was, in truth, his domain, his profit, his power, and his permission was the soil on which the market grew. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see the king, distant yet near, for his authority stretched into the very heart of the square through charters granted, parchments sealed with wax that declared, this market may be held each week, this town may hold a fair each year. And without such charters, markets were vulnerable, easily closed, easily challenged. But with them they stood strong, recognized, protected, woven into the larger fabric of the realm. And so each stall, each sale, carried a whisper of royal approval. The unseen presence of the crown. Breathe softly, and now let us notice the guilds. Those brotherhoods of craftsmen who organized themselves into order, who set rules for how cloth might be sold, how bread must be weighed, how apprentices should learn, and their halls stood proudly at the edges of the square. Carved beams dark with smoke, banners hung with symbols, and their members walked with dignity, enforcing their standards, ensuring that trade was not wild but disciplined, not lawless but bound, and so the guilds too held power here. power born of skill and solidarity. Stay with me, for in a moment you will sense the church's role. The bells ringing over the square, the priests watching, sometimes blessing, sometimes warning, reminding sellers of fair measures, reminding buyers of honesty, preaching against greed, urging generosity. And though their words could not halt the haggling, they did set a moral frame, a reminder that even amid trade, souls were weighed. And in this way authority of conscience mingled with authority of law. Breathe again, and notice how these powers, Lord King, Guild, Church, did not always flow smoothly together, but sometimes clashed, sometimes overlapped, and the market was the ground where their tensions played out. Where lords tried to levy higher dues, guilds resisted. Townsfolk appealed to royal charters, priests decried excess, and the square itself became not only a stage of goods, but of negotiation, of quiet struggles over who truly commanded. Stay with me, because in a moment you will realize that even the very layout of the market bore marks of power. The Lord Steward's table placed high, where dues were paid. The guild's stall prominent, showing mastery. The church steps used as a pulpit for announcements. The town hall rising beside the square, where officials wrote records and stamped seals. And so every corner of the market carried a sign of who held sway, who claimed voice, who directed the flow of life. Breathe softly, and let us think of the way beams. Those tall wooden frames where sacks of grain were measured with iron weights, for they too were instruments of power, certified by guild or lord, their accuracy enforced. And though to the eye they were simple tools, in truth they symbolized authority, the right to declare fairness, to define value, and thus even measures became marks of governance. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see how disputes were settled here. For when buyers accused sellers of cheating, when stalls quarreled over space, when strangers clashed with locals, it was not solved by shouting alone, but by officials stepping forward, by stewards or guild elders or town bailiffs, whose judgments were binding, whose words carried weight. And thus the market was a court as much as a square, a place where justice and order were woven into daily life. Breathe again, and notice how festivals and fairs brought power into sharper light. For when great annual fairs were held, kings sometimes sent officials, lords paraded with guilds displayed pageantry, churches held processions, and the market became a theatre of authority. Banners waving, seals displayed, pronouncements read aloud, and though buyers and sellers might focus on goods, they could not ignore the layers of power shimmering above. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how markets even shaped freedom. For towns that grew wealthy through trade sometimes purchased liberties, charters of self-rule, declaring they would govern their own markets, elect their own officials, keep their own profits. And in such cases, the market square became a symbol of independence, of collective strength, the place where citizens gathered to affirm rights, to ring bells in pride, to declare that their town was more than a lord's possession, more than a king's gift, it was its own. Breathe softly, and think too of the subtle ways power touched everyday trade. A guild mark stamped on bread, a royal seal on measures, a tax added to salt, a toll collected at the gate, and while these may have seemed small, they reminded every hand, every coin, that nothing in the market was untouched by authority, that every loaf, every cloth, every nail carried an invisible thread tying it to the structures above. Stay with me, for in a moment you will realize that this was not only about control, but also about stability. For without such frameworks, the market could collapse into chaos. Cheats running wild, disputes endless, theft unchecked. But with lord, king, guild, and church layered together, the square held form, trust was built, goods exchanged, life continued, and though burdens were heavy, they also brought order, a safety net that allowed the market to thrive. Breathe again, and imagine the pride of a guild master standing in the square, his stall shining with goods marked by his brotherhood's symbol, knowing he upheld not only his craft but his city's honor. Imagine the relief of a merchant seeing the king's charter read aloud, knowing his trade was protected by royal decree. Imagine the humble seller paying dues to the steward, sighing at the cost but comforted by the guard at the gate, by the walls that kept him safe. And in each case power was both a burden and a shield, both a cost and a gift. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll sense the deeper truth that the market, though full of noise and barter, though seemingly free, was also a woven web of authority. And within this web people found both limits and security, both rules and freedom. And so power was not an intruder here, but part of the very fabric of trade. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that medieval markets, far from being mere gatherings of peasants and traders, were arenas of governance, where lords asserted rights, kings extended reach, guilds enforced standards, and churches spoke of conscience, and that in their interplay lay the stability and the tension of the medieval world. For power was always present, always shaping, always flowing, and the market was the place where it became most visible, most tangible, most lived. Breathe once more, and as this chapter closes, imagine yourself standing in the square as banners of guilds ripple in the breeze, as the steward counts coins at his table, as a charter is read aloud on the church steps, as merchants nod in respect and townsfolk listen with quiet attention, and you feel how beneath the hum of trade there lies a deeper hum, the hum of order, of rule, of power itself. And let that awareness settle gently over you like the tolling of a bell, steady, calm, inevitable, as we prepare to move into the next chapter, where we will explore how entertainment and spectacle filled the square, how jugglers, minstrels, and festivals added joy to the market's authority, weaving laughter into its order. And now, dear friend, as we walk together into the market square one last time, let us shift our gaze from the stalls of goods and the shadow of authority to the sounds of laughter, the shimmer of music, the swirl of color and spectacle. For the market was not only a place of barter and law, but also a place of joy, where entertainers mingled with merchants, where jugglers and dancers, minstrels and fools gave shape to delight. And as you breathe softly with me, you will see that this merriment, though light, carried weight of its own, shaping memory, easing toil, weaving bonds of community in ways that lasted beyond the day. Imagine first the arrival of the minstrels, their instruments slung across their backs, lutes polished, drums strapped, flutes ready, and as they step into the square, they strike a note, clear and sweet, a melody that threads itself into the air above the hum of trade, and soon a small crowd gathers, children wide-eyed, adults smiling, some tapping their feet, and though coins may or may not fall into their caps, their gift is already given, for music needs no measure. It fills the space with warmth, with rhythm, with a reminder that life is not only labor, but also song. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see the jugglers, brightly clothed, their sleeves fluttering, their hands quick as they toss wooden balls, knives dulled to shine in the sun, hoops and rings that glitter as they spin, and gasps ripple through the crowd as the objects arc high, as the rhythm quickens, as the air itself seems to dance, and the jugglers bow with a flourish, sweat glistening but smiles broad. And in those moments the market is transformed into a stage, its cobblestones a theatre floor, its people an audience bound together in wonder. Breathe softly, and now picture the dancers, scarves of red and gold drifting as they twirl, feet tapping in quick patterns, skirts swirling, arms lifted, and the music drives them, steady and strong. And though the crowd knows the steps are practiced, they cheer as though the dance were new, for each performance feels alive, unique, shaped by the moment, by the watchers, by the energy of the square itself. Stay with me, for in a moment you will see the fools, jesters in motley, bells jingling on their caps, their faces painted in smiles, their voices loud but harmless, mocking lords gently, teasing guildsmen, making children laugh with pratfalls and silly songs. And though they seem frivolous, their role is deeper, for they remind all who watch that life, with all its burdens, needs release, needs laughter, needs the freedom of a joke to keep balance. And their presence was as necessary as bread. Breathe again, and imagine the storytellers, their cloaks plain, their voices rich, standing on a bench or stool, weaving tales of saints, of knights, of ancient battles, of love and folly, their words flowing, their gestures wide, and though they hold no instruments, no props, still the crowd leans close, caught by the spell of narrative, carried into worlds beyond the square. And some children clutch their parents' hands tightly, others giggle, others stare in silence. And when the tale ends, applause rises like a sigh, the story settling into memory, ready to be told again at hearths later that night. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice the animals brought for show, dancing bears on chains, dogs leaping through hoops, trained birds flapping and speaking. And though we now see the cruelty of some, in those days they were wonders, marvels that widened eyes, curiosities that added strangeness and awe to the market, and people gathered eagerly, coins ready, eager to glimpse something beyond their daily toil. Breathe softly, and picture to the games that unfolded here, dice tossed on wooden boards, riddles asked, small contests of strength with men lifting stones, boys racing, girls skipping ropes, and the air filled with cheers and laughter. Harmless wagers made, pride won and lost, and in these games the square became playground, binding young and old alike in shared delight. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll hear the festivals layered upon markets. For on feast days the stalls did not only sell but also decorate, banners strung across, flowers scattered, bells ringing, processions winding through with candles and songs, and the market swelled with colour, with sacredness, with joy, its ordinary rhythm lifted into celebration, its familiar stones made radiant by the presence of spectacle. And these days lived long in memory, retold across winters, anticipated with eagerness. Breathe again, and let us think of the merchants themselves, who sometimes joined in the spectacle, calling out with rhyme, singing their wares, juggling apples before offering them, carving wood in view of all, weaving cloth as they sold it. And so trade and entertainment blurred, became one. The act of buying and selling itself turned into performance, into spectacle, into story. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how even the smallest entertainments mattered. A boy whistling on a reed, a girl balancing on a beam, a man carving faces in wood scraps and handing them to children. And these little moments, though simple, gave the market its charm, its humanity, its softness, its sense of being not only necessity but community. Breathe softly, and think too of the fairs at night. Torches lit, shadows dancing, music drifting into the dark, laughter echoing against stone walls. And though the day's trade was done, the night's joy began. Ale flowing, songs sung, dancers circling, and the market that had been serious and practical by day became magical and glowing by night. Its air thick with warmth and fellowship, its people bound closer by joy. Stay with me, for in a moment you will realize the deeper truth, that entertainment in the market was not distraction but connection, not folly but glue. It eased divisions between rich and poor, between townsfolk and traveller. It reminded all of their shared humanity, their need for joy, and in its lightness lay strength. For laughter was a form of survival as much as bread, music as necessary as cloth, dance as healing as wine. And here lies the gentle revelation of this chapter, that medieval markets, often remembered for their goods and their power, were also remembered for their joy. That the cobblestones echoed not only with haggling but with song, not only with hoofbeats but with laughter, and that without these moments of wonder, the market would have been incomplete. A body without a heart, a square without a soul. Breathe once more, and as this final chapter closes, imagine yourself standing in the square at dusk, torches flickering, jugglers tossing hoops that glow in firelight, minstrels plucking strings, children laughing, dancers swirling, fools bowing, storytellers raising their arms to a final cheer, and you feel the warmth of joy, of community, of life itself made vivid and soft in shared moments. And as the sounds fade, as the night settles, you feel not only entertained but comforted, knowing that the market gave more than goods. It gave memory, laughter, identity, and belonging. And so as we leave this journey together, let the hum of that ancient square accompany you into rest. Gentle, warm, unhurried, like the steady glow of lanterns on cobblestones. And let me thank you softly for walking with me through its streets, its stalls, its voices, its joys, and now, as sleep gathers near, I invite you to drift onward into the all-night playlist, where more stories await, quiet and kind, ready to carry you deeper into calm, into dreams, into the safe embrace of history whispered slowly in the night.